Goodbye, blue sky. Did you see the frightened ones? Did you hear the falling bombs? Did you ever wonder why we had to look for shelter when the promise of a brave new world unfurled beneath a clear blue sky? Did you see the frightened ones? Did you hear the falling bombs? The flames are all long gone, but the pain lingers on. With this last sentence, from a clinical perspective, it sounds like trauma. It sounds like PTSD, something being gone, but the pain lingering on. An important part of the lyrics that will direct us is we had to look for shelter when the promise of a brave new world unfurled beneath a clear blue sky. What is a promise? And to what order does it belong? A promise belongs to the order of the symbolic, to the order of language. We build our lives through this order. Everything we do, everything that happens to us in our daily life, we explain or we rationalize through language. Even if it's something that doesn't necessarily fit or that bothers us, we rationalize it. If somebody is mean to us, we can say he was mean to us because he had a bad day. We use words in order to make sense of everything. Also, our fantasy is built through language and through the symbolic order. Our fantasy here being also the Lacanian definition of fantasy. Fantasy not being something imaginary, but fantasy being the story we tell ourselves in order to fit into this world. Who we are, what's special about us, what our purpose is, what we are doing with our everyday life. All this narrative we give to ourselves is also constructed through language, through words. And since this is a bit of a political song being about war, there's also the political idea of fantasy that political parties or nations could use in order to rationalize or to also build a narrative to what's happening throughout a nation. For example, the narrative of the Nazi party in Germany in the 1940s, there was all a symbolic narrative to it, a symbolic fantasy as to what they are doing. Or Trump in the United States and what he wants to do with America. This was also a fantasy built through words, or in this case, in the case of this song, the fantasy of Britain and of World War I and then World War II. So there was this promise of a brave new world belonging to the symbolic order. And what is trauma for Lacan? Trauma is caused by the subject's encounter with what he calls the real. And also here, differentiation, the real is not reality. The real is what goes beyond symbolization, what exceeds symbolizations. It's what we don't have words for. For example, you're sitting in your room with your partner and you're having a conversation, a symbolic conversation about all the things you really care about in life, and it's all very emotional and you find it all to be very important in this symbolic fantasy of yours, of this couple. Suddenly an earthquake happens, your partner dies in front of you in 3 seconds. This is the real. You don't have words for this. This didn't fit in your fantasy, it didn't fit in your narrative. It's the real hitting you in the face, something beyond words. Another example, a child being sexually abused, a sexually abused child. The child still doesn't have any clear idea as to what sexuality or sex really means. So there's this thing being imposed on this child who doesn't even have the words for it. And this is an aspect of maybe trying to understand why sexual abuse is so traumatic for a child. The traumatic event, by belonging to the real, by fragmenting the fabric of the symbolic order, destabilizes the fantasy of the subject. It destabilizes the reality the subject had built using language. This is a quote. Trauma as an encounter with the real awakens the subject out of his dream without any warning. And the pain lingers on. Why does the pain linger on in trauma? Because we cannot rationalize what happened. As I said before, we use words to rationalize what happens in our life, but we don't have the words to rationalize for the traumatic event. So it lingers on, it stays there as this unresolved glitch in your symbolic fantasy. We don't have the words for it. It surpasses our linguistic abilities. This is Lacan. Trauma remains unsymbolizable and is a permanent dislocation at the very heart of the subject. For example, also, if you've been through clinical practices, a PTSD patient, somebody that's coming to explain to you their trauma, there's always this frustration of trying to explain what happened to them. And the more they speak, the more they're frustrated. The more they try to explain to you how they really felt at the moment of the traumatic event, the more the frustration of not really being able to express what this really provoked in them comes along, because the words are never enough. So the promise of a brave new world was the symbolic, it was the fantasy. The bombs and the flames were the real that came and punctured through that promise and punctured through the fabric of the fantasy.